So we're going to jump into this, continue on in Mark. And today I want to talk to you about something that is kind of an overarching theme throughout the whole book. We're not going to get in too deep to any particular text, but we're going to be looking at some stuff between Mark chapter 8 through 10, all right? And Bartimaeus, I'm going to mention that, a little bit of the rich young ruler, as Luke calls him. Mark just calls him a rich man. We're going to look at some different things. Peter's confession, when he says that you are the Messiah, Jesus tells him, "Get behind me, Satan." We're going to look at a few of these different things. So, but first, let me remind you of something. So you may recall earlier in this series on Mark, when I told you that it's good when you read Mark to pay attention to location. All right, you remember that when I told you that you need to pay attention to location. And the reason is because place matters in Mark's gospel. You know, we don't need to just pay attention to what happens in the gospel, but we need to pay attention to where things happen. When, yes, but also where things happen. Because places in Mark, they often have a symbolic meaning that runs deeper than just the actual place that we're reading about. Let me remind you of a few things to break this down so y'all know what I'm talking about. So houses, for example. Houses in Mark, there's a lot that takes place in houses. They go to Peter's house, to this person's house, to this person's house. Houses are not just homes for families in Mark. They're not just structures, but they are safer spaces for reflection, renewal, recharge. When they would withdraw, we talked about engagement and withdrawal. When they would withdraw, they would often go to houses. So houses have a deeper meaning in Mark. Another is the synagogue or the temple, these religious places. They're not just religious places of worship, but in Mark really sees them as places of conflict and oppression, mistreatment of others. Jesus' beef in Mark is not with Judaism, it's with the religious authorities that had this political and religious authority and were using it to hurt others, okay? And so the synagogue and the temple are kind of symbolic space. And so often Jesus has conflict with demons in the synagogue. He has conflict with authorities in the synagogue. So those spaces, when something happens there, you need to pay attention to what is Jesus confronting in those spaces. Another is the wilderness. The wilderness is not just this kind of beautiful rustic place outside of town. It's not like just the Red River Gorge or something where you can go and see something beautiful. No, the wilderness in Mark is a place of struggle. It's a place outside of the halls of power. And it's really a place in Mark where the poor, where they were organizing, where they were connecting. John the Baptist was doing a lot of that organizing and connecting and empowering out in the wilderness. And so the wilderness is kind of juxtaposed to the cities and the places of power. The sea, let's talk about the sea, for instance. The sea is really in Mark the lake. It's the Sea of Galilee. It's really a lake. But Mark refers to it as a sea for a reason, because the sea is not just a place to fish for Mark. It's a place of struggle, boundary breaking, of fear. The sea was kind of a frightening place at times when storms would roll in. And so when something's happening on the sea, pay attention to the struggle, to the fear, to the breaking boundaries. What is going on the sea? And so that's a symbolic meaning there. And today we're going to talk about another place in Mark. It's a little different from the others I've mentioned, but it's, I think, the most important. And it's this. It's the way. All right, the way. So the way, you'll read in Mark that Jesus is always on the way. You'll hear that phrase, as they were on the way. They were on the way here. They were on the way there. And now, the way is not just a road or a path or a trail that leads from one place to another. It is that, but that's not all it is. For Mark, the way is the place for discipleship. What does that mean? That means it is where disciples are to be found. If you want to be a disciple, you need to be on the way. So the question for us today is very simple, but it's going to take some deep reflection for all of us. And it's this: are you on the way? If you want to be a disciple, if you think you are a follower of Jesus, are you on the way? Are you on the way of Jesus? You know, Jesus called ordinary folks like you, like me, to follow him. He called people to follow him. You may recall the stories when he would say, hey, come follow me. And what happened is early on, those disciples literally dropped their nets. They dropped what they were doing and they followed Jesus. And they literally followed him along roads, along paths from town to town. They were on the move. They were going from place to place doing ministry. They were on the way with Jesus. Though something deeper was happening. Not only were they literally following Jesus around from actual place to place, but they were also learning to follow a new way of life. Y'all got to get this. They weren't just following him around from place to place, but they were learning to follow a new way of life. Jesus was teaching them through his example. Their discipleship was not just learning about doctrines about God or theology in their mind, but it was a school on the road. They weren't going to the synagogue to sit in a circle and listen to Jesus teach. No, Jesus took them out. He said, we're getting out and we're going to go learn together. And I'm going to show you what this new way of life is all about. I'm going to show you what this new path that we're making in the wilderness, this new way that John the Baptist talked about, Jesus was showing them through example. It was a school on the road. They were learning a new way of being and acting in this violent and broken world. Beginning in chapter 8, like I mentioned before, the Gospel of Mark shifts. This is the halfway point. 16 chapters in Mark. Chapter 8 is the pivoting point. And they start to make the journey towards Jerusalem. And the mood changes. The focus changes. It becomes darker, more grim. You can kind of tell that things are about to get bad. Mark starts to be pretty hard on the disciples, showing their failures and misunderstandings. He's very honest about the disciples, which I appreciate because he doesn't glamorize them. He doesn't glorify them and make them out to be these super Christians. No, he shows their struggles and their misunderstandings. And so in these chapters from chapter 8 on, Mark begins to make something really, really clear. He begins to make it clear that staying on the way with Jesus is really, really, really hard. It's hard stuff. And we've got to know that and be sober about that following Jesus on the way is not easy. He doesn't lead us down easy paths. He doesn't. You know, Jesus told a parable about this earlier in Mark. It's one of the most popular parables, and you all may know it. It's called the parable of the Sower. We've talked about this at Embrace before, but the parable of the sower is an important parable in Mark. And what we find is it's coming up again in these chapters, though not explicitly. So let me remind you of this parable. In this parable, the farmer goes out and scatters seeds in this story Jesus told. And some of the seed he scattered fell beside the way. Other seed fell among rocky soil. Other seed was scattered among the thorns. And some was scattered in good soil. And the parable is meant to teach us about the obstacles to discipleship. The things of life that get in the way and prevent us from following the way of Jesus. And so what happens is we fast forward to this last half of the gospel, chapters 8 through 16, and we're given kind of real life examples of these exact obstacles that Jesus was talking about. We see examples of Satan snatching up the seed beside the way. We see examples of shallow faith in rocky soil. We see examples of wealth choking out the commitment to Jesus' call to equity and redistribution. We see many obstacles leading the disciples to mess up, to fall away, and to get off track. And I'm thankful that these obstacles are in there because we all face obstacles, right? We all get off track. We all mess up. We all fall away sometimes. Sometimes Satan kind of snatches us up and we get in the wrong frame of mind or we go down the wrong path. We have shallow faith sometimes. We have wealth in America. This is probably the biggest problem we have is that it chokes out our commitment to Jesus. I wonder what obstacles you face when trying to stay on the way with Jesus. It's a question we need to think about. What obstacles do you face? You know, recently, over the last few months, Tanya, Christina, Landon, myself, some other leaders, we've been talking in many different conversations about how our community here at Embrace can help each other grow into disciples. Because we don't want to just be believers, but we want to actually be disciples. How can we actually be disciples like the folks in the Bible where we're following Jesus along the way? Some of you all have mentioned that you want to be discipled. You've said, I want to be discipled. I want to grow in my faith. Now, in some faith traditions, for folks who want to be discipled, they would go through what they might call a catechism, which would be a class or a process mostly focused on learning basic doctrines and kind of theology, beliefs of your church community. And I've known students who went through a Catholic version of this, where they learned many doctrines, were quizzed on what they learned at the end, and then they kind of completed the course. The United Methodist Church often does confirmation for young people, where they go through confirmation, they learn the history and the theology and the doctrines of the United Methodist Church and the Bible, and then at the end, maybe they'll stand up in front of the church and get baptized, or they would make a public confession of faith for everybody to hear. I'll tell you that Mark's catechism or Mark's discipleship class is very different from what we mostly do today. For Mark, you don't learn to be a disciple through studying doctrines in a classroom. For Mark, disciples learn on the way. It's a traveling school, on the road, learning by listening and by doing. Learning by listening and studying, yes, but mainly in Mark's discipleship course, you learn by doing, by practicing, by trying it out. You think about my brother, and some of you went to medical school. My brother's a surgeon, and he went to medical school and learned a lot of head knowledge. But then afterwards, he had to do a residency. And in residency, you watch someone else do it, and then you do it yourself alongside, you assist, and then you end up doing it by yourself. And the idea is that residency, you're not just learning by listening, but you're learning by doing. You're practicing it. And I think in the Christian faith, we often miss that piece of what it means to be a disciple. We don't learn by actually participating and doing and practicing. Jesus, when he invited people to come and learn and grow and change, he invited them not just to believe in him, but he said, hey, come follow me. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to show you how to do this. We watch and we learn on the way through practicing it, through doing it. In chapter 8 of the Gospel of Mark, we see this. I'm going to explain this. It kind of shows us what I'm talking about. In chapter 8, Jesus asked Peter a very important question. And y'all may remember this question. It's an important part in the gospel. But Jesus basically asked Peter, he says, Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter responds with an important confession of faith. He says, you are the Messiah. Now, this is big, all right? Through 8 chapters, Peter has spent enough time with Jesus. He's thought enough about all this to learn a fundamental belief about Jesus. He figured it out. Jesus is the Messiah. Way to go, Peter. You got it right. You figured out a basic tenet, fundamental fact about who Jesus is. Good job, Peter. You are on the right track. You got it right. Or did Peter get it right? We're not so sure, because if you read on just a few moments later, Peter shows us that he still has a whole lot left to learn. Jesus tells his disciples after that, he says, okay, you're right, but get this. The Son of Man, which is how he referred to himself, is going to suffer. He's going to eventually be killed. He's going to be handed over to the authorities, going to be executed. And that's big news for the disciples to hear. This was the first time Jesus had told them. Jesus is going to suffer. He's going to eventually be killed. They're probably thinking, what? Like, this movement's gaining steam. We're moving forward in the right direction. You're the Messiah. You're the one going to deliver us from the hand of our enemies. They hadn't planned on that happening. They were likely hoping for a rise to power. They were hoping to sit on Jesus right and left on the seat of power, right? Yet Jesus says, no, guys, I'm not going to make it. They're going to get me eventually. This is what happens to people like me. I'm going to be killed. And so Peter hears Jesus say this, and Peter intervenes, And he pulls Jesus aside, and the text tells us he rebukes Jesus for saying such things. Now, I'll tell you that that's not a good idea to rebuke Jesus. I don't know if he's not in the right frame of mind at that moment. Peter didn't like the idea of the Messiah suffering. He didn't want his friend to suffer. And so Jesus, he gets a little upset with Peter, and he doesn't like Peter trying to tell him what to do, because that's not Peter's place in the movement. And so Jesus says something to Peter that shows Peter clearly where his spot is, where he is supposed to be in this movement. Where is the place of the disciple? And he says something very harsh, but it makes sense why he said it. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." He says, you don't have the things of God on your mind. You have the things of humanity and this world on your mind. You're not getting it. He says, "Get behind me." Now, these may sound like harsh words to you, but what is happening here is exactly what the parable of the sower warned against. Satan was coming in and trying to snatch Peter away from beside the way. Satan tries to subvert Peter's commitment to Jesus in the way of Christ. Satan wants Peter to stay beside the way instead of following Jesus on the way. Satan doesn't want Peter to submit to the way of Jesus. And so Jesus rebukes Peter, and he reminds Peter of his place in the movement. It's behind Jesus. He's like, "Get behind me. I'm leading you somewhere, and if you want the path to life, get behind me, because I'll show you where to go. Peter, your job is to follow me. I'm not following your agenda." How often do we want to get up in front of Jesus and say, "Jesus, you follow me and you help me out where I want to go"? And maybe Jesus is saying, "No, you get behind me," because that's the place of the disciple. Kind of hard words to hear, but I think we need to hear those. And Peter certainly needed to hear it in that moment. You know, Peter's confession that Jesus was the Messiah had no value or meaning if he wasn't willing to take up his cross and follow Jesus. To be a disciple of Jesus is less about a confession of faith, and it's more about the imitation of Christ. You hear me? It's less about a confession of faith, and it's more about the imitation of Christ. It's less about admiring Jesus, and it's more about following Jesus. In Mark chapter 10, I just want to briefly mention these two men that we find in Mark chapter 10. We meet two men along the way. Christina mentioned one of them, Bartimaeus, and there's another one, the rich man. You've probably heard the story of the rich young ruler. That's what Luke calls him. Mark just calls him a wealthy man of great means. So the first is a rich man. This man admired Jesus. He had great admiration for Jesus. This rich man had great wealth. He owned many properties, while most people around him suffered in poverty. Jesus loved this man, and he invited this man to follow him. He invited him to follow. He's like, "Hey, come follow me." But the rich man refused because he wasn't willing to part with his wealth and right his wrongs and share his wealth with the poor. He is like the seed sown among the thorns, right? Money and wealth put a stranglehold on him and prevented him from being a disciple. He admired Jesus. He had great admiration for Jesus, but he refused to follow Jesus. He just wanted to kind of stay beside the way and cheer Jesus on, but it refused to follow. This is the only discipleship rejection story in Mark. And maybe us Americans ought to pay attention to this because it's all about wealth. And this is the only example of someone who's invited to follow and says, "No, I'm not willing to do it." The second man that Jesus meets along the way in Mark chapter 10 is a blind man outside of Jerusalem named Bartimaeus. He meets him in Jericho. Jericho, I've been there before. It's right kind of the last stop before your final journey up the road to Jerusalem. There were likely lots of beggars trying to find help from the many travelers that would have passed through Jericho. The man heard Jesus had come to his spot in Jericho, and he was excited, and he went and headed to find Jesus. The man went and begged Jesus to heal him. He admired Jesus, and he knew Jesus had power, and so he went and fell at Jesus' feet. And he threw his only possession he had aside, his cloak. So the rich man wouldn't give up anything. This man gave up the only thing he had, his cloak, which was an important tool for a beggar to use. He fell at Jesus' feet, and Jesus healed him of his blindness. And then the man decided, I'm going to follow Jesus along the road. And so he followed Jesus, even when he knew that path up to Jerusalem was a dangerous path of possible violence and likely conflict with the authorities. He was a follower, not just an admirer. Two very different stories, right? One was a man who stood beside the way, and he wanted to learn from Jesus and admire him, but he didn't want to follow. The other man radically reoriented his life and followed the way of Jesus, even when that path led him to a dangerous place. Mark holds nothing back in his gospel. He is abundantly clear. To be a disciple is to follow Jesus along the way. Let me share a quote by Soren Kierkegaard, who was a Danish philosopher who wrote about this very thing in the 1800s. And this is powerful stuff, y'all. So follow along with me. He says, "It is well known that Christ consistently used the expression follower. He never asked for admirers, worshipers, or adherents. No, he calls disciples. It is not adherents of a teaching, but followers of a life Christ is looking for. Jesus came to be the pattern, to leave footprints for the person who would join him, who would become a follower. The admirer never makes any true sacrifices. He always plays it safe, though in words, phrases, and songs, he is inexhaustible about how highly he praises Christ. He renounces nothing, though. He will not reconstruct his life and will not let his life express what it is he supposedly admires. Not so for the follower. No. The follower aspires with all his strength to be what he admires." That quote is so powerful. I've always loved his thoughts on that. He says that Jesus never asked people to worship him. He never asked people to admire him. He called women and men to follow him. He showed them a way of life, a pattern. He gave us a pattern that all of us should follow. And his followers were invited. It's a beautiful invitation to life. It's an invitation to reconstruct our life around Jesus and his boundary-breaking lifestyle of love. We're invited to join him, to reconstruct our life around Jesus and his boundary-breaking lifestyle of love. To confess Jesus as Lord and Messiah, to sing his praise and to give him honor, it requires a commitment to follow the way of Jesus in tangible, loving ways in our public and private lives. As Kierkegaard said, the follower aspires with all her strength to be what she admires. So I just want to reflect just for a moment as we enter into our time of communion. And I'll throw just a couple these are just some simple questions, and y'all may have your own that you can ask, but are you on the way with Jesus? I like the distinction between being beside the way and on the way. There were a lot of folks that wanted to say beside the way and just cheer Jesus on. But Jesus was truly calling people, no, come join me, actually. Don't just stand over there and talk good about me, but come join me. Get into the mess with me. Get into the messiness of life and ministry with me. And that's what Jesus is inviting us to do. And that's the path that's going to lead to life. Our American way of living or other ways of living in our world, they have not led to joy and peace, and we're not happy. We don't have fulfillment. Jesus is inviting us to a really radical way of life that will actually lead to life and fulfillment. Are you on the way with Jesus? And then what obstacles are preventing you from following the way of Jesus in your day-to-day life, at work, at home, in your family, in your day-to-day existence, so when you're interacting with folks? What's preventing you from following the way of Jesus in your day-to-day life? For you, it might be wealth. It might be comfort. It might be distraction. It might be some issues that you're facing. There may be all sorts of things. But what are they? And what are you going to do about it? Because you can name the obstacles, but what are you going to do about it? And then I like the idea of what transforming initiative can you take to make a change? What initiative can you take that's going to help you make a change? And the Bible can help you figure that out. I'll help you figure that out. If you're going through something and you have some obstacles in your life, reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you about that. And we'll come up with some transforming initiatives together to help you move on that path to change. And you can help me as well, because I need it just as much as you all do.